The summer sun of July 1402 beat down upon the Anatolian plateau with a ferocity that seemed to rival the tempers of the two men about to collide beneath it. Dust, kicked up by hundreds of thousands of hooves and marching feet, hung suspended in the hot air, turning the sky a sickly shade of ochre. On the plain of Kubuk, just northeast of the city of Ankara, the fate of the Near East, Europe, and the legacy of the Islamic world was about to be decided in a single cataclysmic afternoon. This was not merely a skirmish over borders or a dispute over trade routes. This was the meeting of two immovable objects, two distinct eras of conquest crashing into one another. On one side stood the rising sun of the Ottoman Empire, a disciplined, multi-ethnic war machine that had brought the Balkans to their knees and was currently strangling the last life out of Constantinople. On the other side stood the twilight storm of the steppe nomads, the last great eruption of Mongol power, led by a man whose name was whispered in terror from Delhi to Damascus. To understand the magnitude of the Battle of Ankara, one must first understand the titans who led these armies. They were men who had never known defeat, commanders who believed themselves to be the chosen instruments of divine will. In the west, there was Sultan Bayezid I. They called him Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, a nickname earned for the speed with which he moved his armies across vast distances. Bayezid was the epitome of the early Ottoman spirit, aggressive, confident, and perhaps fatally arrogant. He had crushed the Crusade of Nicopolis just 6 years prior, annihilating the cream of French and Hungarian chivalry. He had unified much of Anatolia under his banner and had turned the Byzantine emperor into a vassal. In his mind, he was the heir to Rome and the sword of Islam, and his eyes were fixed firmly on the conquest of the West. But from the east came a force that Bayezid had woefully underestimated. Timur, known to the West as Tamerlane, was the lord of the auspicious conjunction. Lame in one leg and paralyzed in one arm from old wounds, he was nearly 70 years old when he rode into Anatolia, yet his mind was as sharp and ruthless as a freshly whetted blade. Timur viewed himself as the spiritual successor to Genghis Khan, though he was a Turkic Muslim rather than a Mongol shamanist. His career had been a long, bloody tapestry of destruction. He had razed cities in Persia, massacred the populations of India, and humbled the Golden Horde in Russia. Unlike Bayezid, who sought to build a centralized state, Timur was a conqueror in the old nomadic mold. He sought submission, tribute, and the glory of victory. He was a master of psychological warfare and strategic maneuvering, a chess player who viewed the battlefield as a puzzle to be solved with terror and precision. The road to Ankara was paved with diplomatic insults. For years, the two rulers had exchanged letters that escalated from cautious warnings to outright vitriol. Bayezid, drunk on his own successes in Europe, made the fatal mistake of treating Timur as a mere bandit chief. He insulted Timur's lineage, threatened his harem, and challenged him to do his worst. Timur, in turn, methodically dismantled Bayezid's alliances. He offered sanctuary to the Anatolian beys whom Bayezid had dispossessed, while Bayezid sheltered the enemies of Timur. The collision was inevitable. It was a clash of egos as much as armies. When Timur finally moved, he did not come straight for Bayezid. He sacked the city of Sivas in eastern Anatolia, burying the Armenian defenders alive to circumvent his promise not to shed their blood. It was a message, grim and unmistakable. Bayezid, who had been overseeing the siege of Constantinople, was forced to lift the blockade and march his army east. And here is where the campaign was truly lost, long before the first arrow was loosed. Bayezid, accustomed to the cooler climates of the Balkans and the predictable warfare of Europe, marched his troops forcefully through the scorching heat of the Anatolian summer. He expected to intercept Timur in the east. But Timur, the old wolf of the steppes, was not where he was supposed to be. Utilizing a level of reconnaissance and mobility that the Ottomans could not match, Timur maneuvered his massive army to the south and west, bypassing Bayezid's forces entirely. While the Ottomans were searching for him in the rugged terrain of the east, Timur was already in their rear, laying siege to the city of Ankara itself. The realization of this maneuver must have sent a cold shock through the Ottoman command. Bayezid was now the one reacting, forced to turn his exhausted, thirsty army around and force-march them back toward Ankara to save the city. It was exactly what Timur wanted. He had chosen the battlefield, he had chosen the time, and most importantly, he had secured the water. When the Ottoman army, ragged and parched from weeks of rapid marching under the July sun, finally arrived at the plain of Kubuk, they found that Timur had dammed the local stream, the Kubuk Creek, diverting the water supply away from the Ottoman positions. To make matters worse, Timur had poisoned the wells. The physical condition of the two armies could not have been more different. Timur's troops were well-rested, well-fed, and occupied the high ground. Bayezid's men were on the verge of collapse, their tongues swollen with thirst, staring up at an enemy who outnumbered them significantly. Estimates of the numbers vary wildly in the chronicles, but it is generally accepted that Timur commanded a force of perhaps 140,000 men, while Bayezid led around 85,000. But numbers tell only a fraction of the story. The composition of the armies would prove decisive. Bayezid's force was a complex coalition. At its core were the elite janissaries and the Sipahi cavalry, the backbone of the Ottoman state. But a large portion of his army consisted of conscripts from the newly conquered Anatolian beyliks, men whose loyalty was to their local lords, not to the Ottoman Sultan. Crucially, Bayezid also had a contingent of heavy Serbian cavalry led by his brother-in-law, Stefan Lazarevic. These Christian knights, clad in heavy plate armor, would prove to be the most loyal and effective soldiers on the field that day. Timur's army was a terrifying spectacle of diversity and power. It included Chagatai horse archers, heavily armored cavalry from Central Asia, and troops drawn from every corner of his vast empire. But the weapon that struck the most fear into the hearts of the Ottomans was the war elephants. Timur had brought over 30 of these massive beasts from India. They were air-armored, carrying towers filled with archers and naphtha throwers, early flamethrowers that could sow chaos in the ranks of horses unaccustomed to the smell and sight of such monsters. The battle began on the morning of July 28th with a massive Ottoman attack. Bayezid, despite his disadvantage, was not a man to wait. He launched his left wing, comprised of the Anatolian troops, against the Timurid right. But as the armies clashed, the cracks in the Ottoman foundation shattered open. Timur had been in secret communication with the commanders of the Anatolian beyliks within Bayezid's army. He had promised them the restoration of their lands if they defected. As the lines met, thousands of soldiers on the Ottoman left simply stopped fighting, turned their standards around and joined Timur's forces. In an instant, Bayezid lost nearly a quarter of his army. The betrayal was compounded by the Black Tatars, a nomadic group within the Ottoman ranks who also switched sides, drawn by kinship to the Timurids. Suddenly, the Ottoman army was being attacked from the front and from within. The flank collapsed completely. Panic began to spread. In almost any other circumstance, the army would have routed immediately. That they did not is a testament to the discipline of the janissaries and the valor of the Serbian knights. On the Ottoman right, Stefan Lazarevic and his heavy cavalry smashed into the Timurid lines with incredible force. Their plate armor made them nearly impervious to the Mongol arrows, and they cut a swath through the enemy ranks. Lazarevic fought with such ferocity that even Timur, watching from his command post, was said to have expressed admiration for the lions fighting for the Ottoman Sultan. Lazarevic saw the writing on the wall. He realized the battle was lost and broke through the encirclement to reach Bayezid in the center. He pleaded with the Sultan to flee while the corridor was still open. They could retreat to the mountains, regroup, and save the empire. But Bayezid refused. His pride, the same pride that had led him to underestimate Timur, would not allow him to leave the field. He believed he could still turn the tide, or perhaps he simply preferred death to the shame of retreat. He dismissed Lazarevic, ordering him to save himself, and withdrew with his janissaries to a hill known as Cattle Tepe. What followed was a last stand of epic proportions. Surrounded on all sides by a sea of enemies, the janissaries fought with the desperation of doomed men. Timur tightened the noose. He unleashed the elephants. The great beasts charged up the slopes, smashing through the shield walls, tossing men into the air and trampling the Ottoman elite. The heat was unbearable, the thirst was maddening. Arrows fell like rain, darkening the sky. Yet the thunderbolt held his ground. For hours they repelled wave after wave of Timurid attacks. Bayezid himself, wielding a heavy mace or axe, fought in the front lines, his armor battered, his voice hoarse from shouting commands. But bravery cannot overcome impossible mathematics. One by one, the janissaries fell. The circle shrank until it was just the Sultan and a handful of his bodyguards. Finally, as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the carnage, Bayezid's horse was killed under him. He attempted to escape on foot, perhaps hoping to melt away into the night, but he was run down by Timur's cavalry. The thunderbolt was captured. For the first time in Ottoman history, a sultan was a prisoner of war. The aftermath of the battle was as dramatic as the conflict itself. Bayezid was brought before Timur. The meeting of these two rulers has been mythologized for centuries. The most famous story tells of Timur laughing when he saw Bayezid. When the Ottoman Sultan, enraged, asked why he laughed at his misfortune, Timur reportedly replied that he was laughing because he realized how little God cared for power, having given the world to a cripple like him and a one-eyed man like Bayezid, for Bayezid had lost an eye earlier in his life. Whether this exchange happened verbatim is a matter for historians, but it captures the essence of the moment, the vanity of earthly power exposed by the brutality of fate. There is a persistent legend in the West that Timur kept Bayezid in a golden cage, displaying him like a trophy at dinner parties and using him as a footstool to mount his horse. This imagery was popularized by later playwrights and artists, including Marlowe and Vivaldi. However, contemporary sources suggest a more nuanced reality. Initially, Timur treated Bayezid with the respect due a fellow sovereign. He ordered Bayezid's shackles removed and seated him by his side. But as Bayezid attempted to escape, or perhaps simply as Timur's patience wore thin, the treatment became harsher. The cage was likely a barred litter used for transport, which, to the humiliated sultan, felt like a cage. Bayezid died in captivity just a few months later, in March 1403. Some say he died of apoplexy brought on by shame. Others suggest he took his own life by smashing his head against the bars of his litter or swallowing poison hidden in his ring. His death marked the end of the first great era of Ottoman expansion. The empire he had built shattered into fragments. His sons, freed by Timur or escaping the battlefield, turned on one another, plunging the Ottoman realm into a chaotic civil war known as the Ottoman interregnum. For over a decade, brother fought brother, and the Ottoman state effectively ceased to exist as a unified entity. The consequences of the Battle of Ankara rippled outward, changing the timeline of history in profound ways. The most immediate beneficiary was the Byzantine Empire. Constantinople, which had been on the verge of surrendering to Bayezid in 1402, was given a miraculous reprieve. The Ottoman collapse granted the dying empire another 50 years of life. It would not be until 1453 that Bayezid's great-grandson, Mehmed II, would finally fulfill the Thunderbolt's ambition. Those 50 years allowed for a final flowering of Byzantine art and philosophy, and, crucially, allowed many Greek scholars to flee to Italy, carrying with them the manuscripts that would help ignite the Renaissance. For the Timurids, the victory was the capstone of Timur's career, but it was a fleeting triumph. Timur did not stay to rule Anatolia. He reinstated the minor beyliks, took his tribute, and turned his gaze toward his ultimate prize, China. He would die on the march to the Ming Empire 3 years later, and his own empire would eventually fragment, much like Alexander's. But perhaps the most remarkable outcome of Ankara was the resilience of the Ottoman system. By all rights, the Ottoman Empire should have ended in 1402. The army was destroyed, the Sultan captured, the lands divided, and the neighbors emboldened. Yet the state did not die. The administrative structures, the military traditions, and the concept of the House of Osman proved strong enough to weather the storm. When the dust of the civil war settled and Mehmed I emerged as the sole ruler, the empire began to rebuild with a terrifying speed. They learned from the disaster. They reformed their army, placing less reliance on unreliable vassals and more on the Janissary Corps and field artillery. The defeat at Ankara, rather than killing the Ottoman Empire, forged it into something harder, leaner, and more dangerous. In the grand scope of history, the Battle of Ankara stands as a fascinating what-if. It was the last great victory of the nomadic steppe warriors over the sedentary empires of the Gunpowder Age. It was a collision of military philosophies, the swift encircling archers of the East against the disciplined composite armies of the West. It serves as a potent reminder of the fragility of power. Bayezid I woke up on the morning of July 28th as the most feared man in Europe, the ruler of a burgeoning empire that seemed destined to swallow the world. By sunset, he was a prisoner in chains, his army scattered to the winds, his legacy in ruins. The plain of Kubuk is quiet now. The modern city of Ankara has expanded, covering much of the old maneuvering grounds. But beneath the concrete and the soil lie the bones of thousands who died for the ambitions of two men. It remains a testament to the day when the thunderbolt struck the earth, only to find that the earth struck back with a force he could not comprehend. It was the day the unstoppable force met the immovable object, and the shockwave reshaped the map of the world for centuries to come.